this evening I want to give to you, it's really a repeat, and it's not for the sake of I didn't have time to study and so I'm getting in my drawers and getting an old sermon. It's something that I've been thinking about a lot, and I've gone back to this subject in John chapter 4 and the idea of evangelism that we learn from these verses here, and it's very personal to my meditations and thoughts recently, so I want to share this with you, and hopefully you will benefit as much as I have from reconsidering these things. In John chapter 4, we're going to study verses 27 through 38, and you can get your Bible over there and just kind of stay open in John chapter 4 if you'd like to. We'll read maybe one or two other passages that are not found in that chapter. Leading up and setting the scene for the context of what Jesus is doing here in John chapter 4, I just want to paint a picture of the first century world that Jesus was living in and that the disciples were also living in and evangelizing in. There's three main factors that I think can discourage us when we're thinking about evangelism, and I'm sure as the disciples in this context in this century we're thinking about these three things. Same things we deal with today: civil unrest, public health concerns, and immorality. People that commit immorality and they're not ashamed of it. And those three things were very prominent in that time back in the first century world. If you think about it, the civil unrest factor, there were three main sects, the scribes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees, that had arisen in the times before Christ. About 200 years before Christ, there was the rising of these different sects and the flip-flopping back and forth of the Judean powers, and they're fluctuating from one Roman world from a Greek world and so forth. The Herodians were another sect, the Zealots were another sect, and there were men like Theudas in Acts chapter 5 that were insurrectionists, meaning that they tried to overthrow either local or higher authorities through insurrection and revolution. Barabbas was one of those revolutionaries, and that was why he had been in prison for murder and for insurrection. And so the idea of, I remember back in 2020, there was a lot going on, and one of the things that I saw on the TV a lot, which is right around, I think, the time I stopped watching TV at Ed's house, there was all these just looting and burning, and just, it seemed like the whole world was going down the sewer all in 1 year. And then, on top of that, they also had public health concerns. They had no vaccines back then. And there was measles galore. They just didn't know what to call it. There was diphtheria, there was tetanus, there was everything that we have pretty much eradicated today. They didn't have names for it, but it existed. And when people got sick with pneumonia, I'm sure they didn't call it pneumonia, but it was it was a lot bigger deal than it is today. Even people that die today from pneumonia, but typically somebody gets pneumonia. I think Mitzi had pneumonia recently, and you're worried. At the same time, you feel like you got a pretty good chance of beating that with medications and treatments today. They didn't have that back then. And so when you got sick, it was a lot bigger deal. And then just the immorality. I'm sure just among the common people, immorality has always been a problem. As long as there's been people, sexual immorality has been an issue. But even within their social higher-ups, if you were to do much historical research on the emperors of Rome, they were the most gross men that existed in the whole empire. And they basically ran brothels in their chambers of young boys. And that's called pederasty, where you sexually traffic young males. And were homosexuals and everything else. It was grotesque if you looked at what was commonly accepted and practiced in public. Even that today is not practiced in public in America. And I'm not saying that America is better off than Rome was or that it's worse off. I'm just throwing that out there. These are the things that Jesus walked into in the first century when he walks up to the well and he finds this woman who had been married 5 times, and the woman was living with a man she wasn't married to currently. And so that's when Jesus lifts up tells the disciples, I think it's in verse 35, lift up your eyes and look at the fields, for they're already white for harvest. I think we know that he's not talking about a literal field there, right? And the fact that Jesus would say that when he had just had this conversation with this woman is kind of mesmerizing when you think about how we think sometimes, and certainly how the disciples were thinking. And I want to take you through 3 points from verses 27 through 38 And these will be 3 points about evangelism that we can take and apply today. So let's start with verse 27, and this is where the disciples walk up after this conversation. I'm going to skip the actual conversation with the Samaritan woman, and we walk into the disciples approaching Jesus. And at that point, his disciples came, and they marveled that he had talked with a woman, yet no one said, "What do you seek?" or "Why are you talking with her?" And there are several things about this woman. And notice it says that he talked to a woman. Not that he talked to the woman, like, why are you talking to this woman? That you were talking to a woman at all, that was one mark against her from a social class perspective in that time. Why is the Son of God talking to somebody that in that world was of a lower social class? It just is what it is. I'm not giving my opinion here. That's just what it was. Why are you talking to a woman? Second of all, why are you talking to a Samaritan woman? Because previous in that chapter, the writer of the gospel will tell us that Samaritans had no dealings with Jews, or vice versa. And then on top of that, not only is she a Samaritan woman, she has been married 5 times. What are you doing, Jesus? But of course he says nobody was saying what they were thinking. They were just thinking these things. And of course, Jesus being God, he knows what they're thinking. But what we understand from all this is that Jesus obviously has a different filter that he's looking at people through than what the disciples are looking at people through. And I was also reading, about the disciples. It's interesting who Jesus chose to be his 12, his inner 12. And I was reading a book today on evangelism, and it was just describing these men and who they were. And they were not the brightest. They were not educated. They were not even, when you think about the conversations that Jesus has with them, they weren't even necessarily the most spiritually minded. They were very carnally minded. And these are the guys that Jesus chooses. But they reflect a lot of times the way that we look at people. And we need to look at people, I would propose to you, the way that Jesus looked at the Samaritan woman. My first point being that God wants sinners. And that's what this woman was. And she is not the person that you would look to and think, this is a premier prospect for the gospel, if you use the standards of some people. And I'm just going to be honest with you. I'm going to be very vulnerable tonight about myself, this being one of them. There was a point in time where I thought, and I was probably a freshman in college, maybe I was late in my high school years, where I thought, now honestly, I'm ashamed of this and this is not good, but I thought the person that they didn't drink, they didn't curse, they had a good family unit, they went to church every Sunday, that was the person that was the best candidate in my mind to share the gospel with. Because in my mind, that person was this close to obeying the truth. Because they already got the moral cleanness. They've already got the religious practice down of going to church every Sunday. They've already got a nice family. How is this person, that you're thinking maybe, how is this person not ready to obey the gospel? But what you find out, that's not how Jesus looked at it. He didn't look for those people necessarily. He looked for people who were sinners. And if they fit that mold, then great. And if they fit the mold of somebody that's sleeping with their boyfriend and been married 5 times, then great. It's not about the external pictures of what this person looks like or what kind of lifestyle they live currently. It's about what is their heart. And this woman's heart was the most important thing. Of course, Jesus could judge their heart. But even if you can't judge your heart, you just plant the seed and let God provide the increase, of course. We do that sometimes. We look for the people that, we think ourselves an atheist. I remember thinking about this before, an atheist. They don't even believe in God. They're so far from God. Why would I start talking to an atheist, trying to convince them that God even exists when there's a person over here, they go to a Church of Christ, and they worship differently, but they're so close. If they would just change their worship, then they're so... But what I found out in my conversations, and it's not true about either group, but the individual is what matters. Doesn't matter what group they're affiliated with. It's the individual that matters. And are they a sinner, and do they know that they're a sinner? I think that's what Jesus teaches in another passage in Luke chapter 5 and verse 30. And this is maybe the only other passage I stray from John 4. But in Luke chapter 5 and verse 30, I think Jesus is teaching this concept, what he's looking for when he's preaching the gospel to the woman at the well. It says, "And the scribes and the Pharisees complained against Jesus' disciples, saying, 'Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?' Why do you all the people that I just described that were not prime candidates for the gospel, these are not clean people. Why are you eating with these people, Jesus? Because it didn't fit their mold of prospect. And Jesus answered and said to them, these who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Now this always puzzled me for a long time because you know right well the scribes and the Pharisees are not well. And they are not righteous. And so it always perplexed me why Jesus calls them well and healthy and righteous. And I believe you have to understand Jesus, I don't know if you call it sense of humor or what, but what he is saying, I do believe firmly, is that I'm not looking for people who think they're righteous and think that they're saved. I'm looking for people that know they're lost and know they're a sinner. And these people in this social class, when they meet Jesus, they realize, I'm a sinner and I need this man. I need the Son of God. And sometimes we get in that same habit. We think that we're righteous, but we're not. But even then, when we're preaching the gospel, we think that somebody's righteous because they're clean on the outside, but they're not. And their heart is corrupt, and their heart does not desire the truth of the gospel. And so let us remember that God wants sinners, and that's who Jesus went to, regardless what they look like. And it doesn't matter what group you go to, if you're going to a quote-unquote group. It doesn't matter what the color of their skin is. It doesn't matter what part of the neighborhood they hang out in. It doesn't matter where they work. It's about the individual within that social network and their heart. The next thing, I think in John chapter 4, going on to verse 28, we'll just continue where we left off. It says, the woman then left her water pot, went her way into the city, and said to the men, come see a man who told me all the things I ever did. Could this be the Christ? Then they went out of the city and came to Jesus. In the meantime, his disciples urged him, saying, Rabbi, eat. But he said to them, I have food to eat of which you don't know. Therefore the disciples said to one another, has anyone brought anything to eat? And Jesus said to them, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. And I love that last verse there, verse 34. My food is to do the will of him who sent me. And I highlighted that in my chapter 4 of John so that when I come across it every time through the Gospel of John, I see that and it stands out to me because that captures what our life should be about. Sometimes we'll describe things, and if I don't know if this is still hip to say, the way to describe your life, but it used to be in high school, baseball was life, and or school was life. And that's just a shorthand way of saying that this consumes your existence. And in my day, I couldn't hang out with a lot of my friends because they did bad things. And I couldn't, I didn't have a phone. And there was a lot of things I couldn't do, but I could play baseball, and I really liked baseball. And I would listen to the Braves, and I would practice. I'd go down to the batting cages when nobody was there. And it was my life. I mean, that in church, And that's something I really enjoyed, and it was a priority for me. When I got into college, college was life. And so I went to class. I was taking extra credits. I was working part-time. I was sleeping a little bit, and I was going to church every Sunday and Wednesday. In reality, church was not really life. Going to church every Sunday and Wednesday was a priority, but the thing that was consuming me was college, work, sleep, and food. And that was my life. You can look at it like that. And that was honestly one of the weaker points in my life, just where I had more difficulties because of that. Whatever you place number one in your life, and if it ain't God, it's going to hurt you spiritually. That's just a side point. Let's get back to the point. Okay, what is your life? And really, another way, Jesus says, my food is to do the will of him who sent me. And if we're going to preach the gospel and we're going to be Christians, I'm fully convinced if you're going to be a Bible-believing Christian, and this is should prick the conscience, you cannot be a Bible-believing Christian and not preach the gospel. And I fully believe that you can't be a restored New Testament church, but you're not evangelistic. I heard a preacher say that a long time ago, and it stuck in my head for a long time. And we've been focusing a lot on leadership, and that's consumed a lot of my attention while I've been here in my own personal studies and my teaching and so forth. And now, for the first time, this year I've had an opportunity to focus on the work of an evangelist, that part that's actually evangelism. And so my mind is constantly on how to share the gospel as an individual and as a congregation. And if we're to be the Church of Jesus Christ, we have to be evangelistic. It has to be our life. It has to be our food. And if you were to ever get to a point where you're just sitting down to drink a cup of coffee and what's on your mind? Some people it might be the Super Bowl coming up. But on your mind, it's how am I going to talk to this person next to me? You got to getting to that point. That's a stepping stone, but that's when you realize that this is your food. It's what you're thinking about all the time. You can't go a day without thinking about it. That's Jesus' will to do the will of his Father was his life. So I would encourage you to make that your number one priority in life. The third thing is in verse 35, and this will be the last. No, it's not the last verse we're going to read. In verse 35, it says, "Do you not say there are also still 4 months, and then comes the harvest? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look at the fields, for they are already white for harvest." Now, as we said before, he wasn't talking about food in the previous verse, and he's not talking about literal fields in this verse. Obviously, these are metaphors for something spiritual, and the field is the spiritual field that he has just stepped into when he talked to this spiritual grain of stalk, the woman at the well, who has gone off into the town now. And, I think one thing about this verse here is that I think sometimes we've twisted it maybe to say something that it's really not saying. And that is, by common human experience, if you were to read histories, and even read the gospel, or the Acts history of the early church, not every field was white to harvest. Paul got beat out of several cities physically, and it was not white to harvest. And so you ask Jesus, is he asking us to be the over-optimistic, the brim is overflowing with optimism on each evangelistic field? And again, the history and experience tells you that this is not true, that every field is white for harvest. And it may be that we're in a place, or maybe that you're in a place in the specific community that you live in that is not white to harvest. But this one was, and I think that's what Jesus is saying. Now, I really like Gregory Kokel in his book on tactics, which is a book about how to share the gospel with people. It's a really good book. He says, and I think this is probably true, although I wouldn't take it to the bank and rest my life on it. But he says it was common in that day, and I'm just trusting this statement about the culture back then. It was common for the women back in the day, when they were going in the afternoon to draw water from the well, to be wearing white robes. And so they're standing near the well. The woman's left, but there's other women coming, and they look up, and there's this procession of white robes going to the well. And as we'll keep on reading in just a minute, this field was white for harvest. And a lot of these, if it was white-robed women coming to draw water, a lot of them would be harvested in just a few days. And regardless, I do believe that this city of Samaria specifically is what Jesus is talking about. The people in this city were ready for the gospel. Now, reading on in verse 36, there's a couple of minor details that we can separate and bring out as well. In verse 36, "He who reaps receives wages and gathers fruit for eternal life, that both he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. For in this the saying is true, one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap that for which you have not labored. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labors." Notice verse 36, something that I read over many times until it was brought to my attention, is that he who sows and he who reaps rejoice together. But they're two different people. You've got sowers and reapers, and they're not always the same. And understand that planting the seed of the gospel, even just a small seed, or a big seed, is sowing. And then reaping is whenever you come across seed that's already been planted, maybe by yourself or maybe by this other person, and you bring forth the fruit that was planted maybe a long time ago. I know John's talked about the seed that was planted in his heart many years prior, before it was ever reaped by someone much later. There's many examples in this congregation like that. But it's two different things. And I think the goal of the person that's sowing the seed, as another thing from Gregory Copley, he said, is to put a rock in their shoe. And what that illustration conveys in my mind is you want to put something in the person's shoe that makes them want to take off the shoe and look at it and see, what is that thing? Something that aggravates them. And I'm not necessarily aggravating in the sense that makes them mad. Maybe sometimes it's been very effective to make people mad. In stories of preachers, they intentionally preached a hellfire sermon when they knew the person was from a specific denomination to make them mad, and it actually led to their salvation. I'm not saying do that all the time, but it has worked. The rock in the shoe is simply something to nudge them, something to give them to chew on and to think about, something that they're sitting in the coffee shop, and while everybody else is thinking about the Super Bowl, they're thinking about this seed that you planted in their heart maybe 2 days ago, and it just won't leave their conscience. That's the idea of the sower and what we're trying to do. You don't have to bring the person to the baptistry at the first conversation. Hey, my name's Aaron. Have you heard of the Chapel Grove Church of Christ? Hey, you know what? I think we still got water. Meet me over there at 3. It doesn't have to go that way. And of course, it's not going to go that way. It doesn't take too many experiences like that to realize that's not effective. Now, sometimes it's a little quicker than others, but what I'm trying to say is distinguish sowing from reaping and realize that you don't have to do the whole gamut in one conversation. Another extension of this is that what I already alluded to, and that try to identify who you are. One person can do both jobs, and we have those in this very congregation. And then some people, they're better at having the closing conversation maybe that brings that person into the baptism waters. The other person gets that first person to that conversation by inviting this person to church or inviting them to a Bible study or having had conversations with them along the way. Now, some of y'all were not here back in 2019, and so I'm going to share this story because I love it. But many of you have, and I'm going to also embarrass maybe Caleb for just a minute, because it's about when Caleb, met Justin on the truck. And Justin that sits up here on the front bench, hopefully y'all know him now in the last 3 years. And anyway, so Caleb is a lot better, I feel like, and you can tell me later if this is not true, because sometimes people think that I'm good at things that I'm not actually good at. But I've always thought that you are a lot prettier than me, and you're a lot better at talking to people than me, and that you could have a conversation with people a lot more freely than I can. I feel like I've got to really work to start a conversation with somebody. And like when I do it, I'm actually working. I clocked in. But then there's other people like Caleb and like Tori was this way and Wayne was this way. And I feel like Jesse's this way. William says he's not this way. But, people like that have a lot better skill set to be sowers and sowing that seed. Not that they can't be good at reaping as well, but you really have a gift, I feel like. And anyways, in that story, he was talking to Justin on the truck every day. And Justin is kind of the same way. He likes to talk too. And so in the process, Justin came to our Bible study that we were having on Thursdays or something, and I met Justin. But they'd already been having conversations for a long time. And Justin had a lot of rocks in his shoe. And my part in it was about this long, and but together we were able to baptize Justin, and God received glory. And then through that, Justin planted seed with his best friend and his girlfriend and even his family, and some of that seed took root, and some of that seed didn't take root. But you see, there were sowers on one hand, and there was reapers on the other hand, and it took everybody working together to bring forth the harvest. And not everybody is good at both jobs. Now, I'm going to expound on that a little bit more in just a minute, but that story always sticks out to my mind because it's not every day that you get to experience, 5 or 6 baptisms in 2 months, in America at least. And that's something that I remembered, and it reflects what happened in John chapter 4 and verse 39. So going on to verse 39, it says, "And many of the Samaritans of that city believed in him because of the word of the woman who testified, 'He told me all that I ever did.' So when the Samaritans had come to him, they urged him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days, and many more believed because of his word." Now this passage, I think in verse 39, should embolden us a lot, because it really didn't hit me the first time I even preached this sermon. I didn't even notice this. I preached this sermon, I didn't notice this. But in verse 39, you got Jesus. He's the greatest man, and by all measure accounts, he's the greatest evangelist that ever lived. And it says there in verse 39 that many of the Samaritans of the city believed in him because of the word of the woman. and you got Jesus standing right here. Well, the Holy Spirit, inspiring John, says, I want you to give credit to the woman. And that's emboldening to me. Because God was using this woman, her testimony, to reach people's hearts. And yes, many more people believe because of Jesus' word. Verse 40 says, but these people specifically, because of the seed that Jesus planted in her heart, and then the seed that she went and planted in other people's hearts, your words can lead people to salvation. On the flip side, they can also lead people to damnation. It's a very dangerous tool that we have, our tongue. James tells us that in James chapter 3. And the words that you say can be very powerful because they can influence people to come to Jesus, or they can discourage people because you unnecessarily burn bridges and so forth. Well, this same city in Acts chapter 8, which we're not going to go read, but in Acts chapter 8, this same city, and I'm going to give credit to the woman at the well here. The same city would experience a great revival in Acts chapter 8 whenever the early church was expanding from Jerusalem, and Philip the evangelist goes, just before converting the eunuch, at least in the order of the stories, he goes to Samaria and he baptizes a whole slew of people, calls John and Peter on the cell phone and says, hey, I need you to come lay hands on these guys. And a whole city, which there was probably already many people who had been baptized by John's baptism from John 4, and a church is established there. So if you're like me, this story is rejuvenating because it helps. I'm a glass half empty guy half the time. It helps kind of fill the glass back up. And it should hopefully it encourages you as much as it does me to be about the mission that we have been given to make preaching the gospel our food. Now, I'm not done completely yet. I do have a couple more things that I want to share about evangelism. And these things are not so much like I thought about, I could pull a passage of scripture here and I could say, this helps teach the point. But I'm just going to share 4 things with you that I think will help us to better have conversations and evangelize to people. And I actually was going to Bible study this week and I had to listen to something. And I wanted to listen to a podcast about Wayne Wiles. And I did a podcast about him last year, shortly after he had passed away. And that podcast, I just reflected on things that he was really good at that helped me to think about how to talk to people. So if you haven't listened to that, I know the guy that recorded it, and I can get you the link. But otherwise, I just want to share with you 4 things about Wayne that I think are very effective. And I try to think about these things when I am contemplating talking to the person next to me. So one of the things, the first thing is to talk to everybody. And that's literally everybody. And to me, I am not the person, and I feel ashamed of this almost really because I'm an evangelist, but I'm not the person that likes to go in somewhere and talk to every single person in the room. And so one of the things that I've been deliberately working on is when I'm in line somewhere making small talk with these people that I would never make small talk with before. Because you've got to do that if you're going to have conversation. You've got to do that if you're going to evangelize. And so, talking to everybody, trying to think of ways, like today, honestly, I was looking at ways to start conversations on YouTube, That's just little bits, anything you can pick up to start conversations with people and just be practicing that. And some people look at you weird, and then some people are like, hey, yeah, you live in Summertown, so do I. So anyways, that's the first thing. And I thought of Proverbs 18, verse 24. It says there, now this is one passage that does prove the point. And the proverb says that he who wants to have friends has to be friendly. And that's a pretty timeless proverb. And if you want to evangelize to people, you've got to talk to people. And so that's just number 1, talk to everybody. Number 2 is to focus on your strengths. And that goes back to, I believe, at least for the purpose of this study, if you're a sower, then focus on becoming a better sower. And if you're a reaper, then focus on becoming a better reaper. Now, one of the things that Wayne did that I noticed a lot is he would talk to me a lot about this book, How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. And you've probably heard of it. It's a national bestseller for years and years. And I think he read that book 2 or 3 times. And it struck me one time as he was telling me, I was thinking to myself, why does Wayne need to read a book 2 times on how to win friends and influence people? Because if I know anybody that could talk to people and make a friend, it was him. But that was a strength of his that he was working at to become better at. And so, whatever your strength is, tap into that and then focus on becoming better at that. I think I've shared this illustration before, but I believe this is a true story that Les Brown, a motivational speaker, tells. There was this coach that took over this new baseball team. I believe it was a Major League Baseball team. And he went up to this preacher. He went up to this pitcher in spring training, and he talked to that pitcher. He said, "What's your best pitch?" And the pitcher said, "Well, I have a pretty good curveball, and I've got a decent sinker, and I'm working on a changeup." And he said, "I want to know what's your best pitch." He said, "Well, I have a really good fastball. That's probably my best pitch." And that coach told him, he said, "I want you to work on your fastball, and that's it. I don't want you to focus on your curveball, your changeup, or your sinker. I want you to just focus on that fastball all preseason, and that's it." And so he did that. And the story goes that they went on to win the title the next year. Now, I'm sure it wasn't just because of that pitcher, but it was credited that he led that team to their title and became a very standout pitcher. I was never given the name who it was. But the idea is that take your strength and become better at it. Because you can spend all of your time on the little things that you're not ever going to be great at, or you could spend a lot of time on the thing that you're really good at and make that a real weapon. And a third thing is to talk the Bible with people. So when you're talking to everybody, talk the Bible to people. And that goes for our common conversations at church. Always be talking about the Bible. And that's one of the things that Wayne always did, is we were always talking about the Bible. And sometimes we were talking about the Bible for so long it wearied me. Maybe because of what we were talking about, or we had beat a dead horse twice. We'd killed it twice, on the same thing. But be talking about the Bible with people. And that's one that is difficult. It is difficult to have a conversation sometimes with people that you don't know and just coincidentally bring up Scripture. That can be difficult, but it's something that maybe with practice we can do better at. And then finally, spend time with people. And that's one that's really the hardest, because I say it's the hardest. I don't know it's the hardest. Strike that I said that. It's very difficult to spend time with everybody. And in our fast-paced culture, it's very difficult to just stop what you're doing and just spend time with people, because if you do that, well, then you're going to miss the deadline at 3 p.m. And then if you're married, I hear that your wife's going to wonder where you've been, and I had supper on the table and that kind of stuff, Can't speak from experience, but I believe it. And so it's difficult to be able to maintain our work schedule and all that and just spend time with people. But I did read this today in this book on evangelism that I was reading, and Robert Coleman said this about Jesus, which I thought was simple and yet profound. And this is talking about how Jesus led his disciples and how he molded them into be ready to go on without him in 3 years. It says, "There's simply no substitute for getting with people, and it's ridiculous to imagine that anything less short of a miracle can develop strong Christian leadership," or in this case, converts or Christians. After all, if Jesus, the Son of God, found it necessary to stay almost constantly with his few disciples for 3 years, and even one of them was lost, how can a church expect to do this job on an assembly line basis a few days out of the year? And when he brought up Judas there, go back to the woman at the well. Jesus was there, and yet the credit goes to the woman. In this situation, Jesus was there 3 days, 3 years, constantly with his disciples, and yet one of them is still lost. How important it is to spend time with people, because if you don't spend time with people, you will not influence them, for good or worse. But you can influence them. And he's talking about assembly line leadership being, come to the seminar once a month, and we'll teach you about leadership or something like that. It's about spending your life with this person. And so, it makes me think, like my neighbor. I've got to be deliberate about going to my neighbor when I'm in a rush and going over and just having a conversation with them. And just spend some time with them, even though it may not be convenient. That's something that Wayne was really good at, that a lot of times I get too busy, and that's what really weighs me down. So the review on all those is talk to everybody, focus on your strengths. When you do talk to people, talk about the Bible, bring it up, and spend time with people. Now, with that said, I'm almost done. I really am. Because I've basically given you 2 sermons you probably feel like. I gave you a sermon after the sermon. Now I'm going to give you one last little snippet. What I've it's really weighed on me a lot in terms of, I don't mean like in a bad way necessarily, but weighed on my mind. It's been on my mind a lot. That's what I'm saying. The idea of evangelism, personally, myself. I'm not talking about y'all. I'm talking about myself and evangelism. Because I think Willie maybe mentioned this in his sermon on Sunday. Sometimes you have conversations with people and you feel after it's over with like you're a coward because you could have said something maybe, but you didn't. And maybe it was because you had an appointment or whatever, but you still, a lot of times it's because you're afraid of how this person's going to react if you say something that you feel like might bring in the gospel. And I've done that. And a lot of times just not sharing the gospel when you feel like you could have said something. You could have at least invited them to church or shared a card with them or something. And, just planting a little seed. It doesn't have to be a full-blown conversation. And a lot of times, a little seed that you plant and you pray about that and you believe in the providential work of God, that He will provide a way for that person to hear more or to be saved. And He knows the hearts of these people. That's what we have to trust in, and we have to be deliberate about that. Now, I feel like I have not been good at that. And as a preacher of the gospel, I feel like that's something that I ought to be good at. So it's something that I'm definitely spending a lot of time thinking about and practicing every week. So one of the things that I've decided to do, and I'm going to offer this to anybody that wants to participate, but I would encourage you to not do this right after church. Think about this. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do for myself, and then you can think about this. In Michigan, Aaron Willis is an elder of the church, and some of y'all may know Aaron Willis. He's a really energetic man, great leader. And years before he had become an elder of the church, he had never fully read through his Bible. And he decided, I need to do this. And he would pick it up his reading schedule, and he would start reading, but he would never finish it. And he would do it the next year. And so finally he decided, and this worked, he decided, I'm going to take a poster board and I'm going to put this in the foyer of the church building, and I'm going to put the reading schedule there, and every week that I come to church or every service, I'm going to mark off what I read. And if I don't, then everybody's going to know that I have not read my Bible this week and that I'm behind. And he did that, and lo and behold, he finished reading his Bible that year. And some other people joined in him, and they also read their Bible for the first time in their whole life, even though they had been Christians for many, many years. And I heard him, I don't know if he told me that or if Ron Porter told me that or who, but I just thought that was a brilliant idea, and it's accountability. We've been hearing a lot talk about accountability recently. And so what I've done and what I'm going to do is I've got this poster board, and I'll explain this to you in brief, but it's a wide one so that if more names, if anybody wants to participate, you're welcome to. But this is the idea to get me to have daily conversations with people deliberately and just invite them to church or give them a card and say, hey, check this website out or whatever. So I've got the month of the year, and I'm going to start this February 1st. And every day of the month, and I'm going to put this on the bulletin back there so that everybody can see it. And when I come on Wednesday, my goal is to have 5 working days of the month, so Monday through Friday, to have talked with at least one person and given them something, or just, had a Bible conversation with them or something that's not a member of the church. And then I'll come and I'll mark it off, the 5 days of the work week. So there's going to be some blanks because I'm trying to make it achieve. I'm not trying to kill myself just starting off the bat, right? But I'm going to put this back there, and y'all will be able to see that, and it'll drive me, I think, that when I'm not feeling like talking to the person in the Chick-fil-A aisle, I think that will make me want to do it a little bit more, and that'll maybe push me over the edge. So I've got to do this because I remember in 2021, I wrote my year-end review in my journal online, and I said one of the things I was most disappointed in is that I had missed a lot of opportunities at evangelism. I had specific people that I had in my head. And then at the end of 2022, at the end of that journal review, the same thing. And I said, this can't happen 3 years in a row because it just keeps happening. And so this is my way of holding myself accountable to you guys, and hopefully this will encourage you to also be more diligent about this. So you're welcome. Just let me know if you'd like to sit down and talk about what am I working on? What can you do to get better at conversations and just talking to people? Then we can sit down and talk about that. But don't run back and put your name on this board, because then that would be maybe too premature. Well, if anybody's here and has not obeyed the gospel, that is an appropriate age, and you've heard the gospel for a long time, and you're finally ready to get into the waters of baptism, then this is a good time to do that tonight. And if there's anybody here that needs to confess their sins or shortcomings or weaknesses to the brothers and sisters here, then why don't we take advantage of that opportunity to do that now while we stand and sing. Thanks for watching this video. I know what you're thinking. I don't want to miss another video from this channel. In order to avoid that, click on the red button down there, subscribe, and then click the bell icon. Not only will that alert you each time a new video is uploaded to the channel, it will also help spread the channel to other people's awareness. So, go ahead, do it. Like right now, click on it.